I may or may not get to this, so don't worry about this right now. I'm going to talk to you about the political economy of British India. This is a subject on which I had started talking to you in my previous lecture. In the last few minutes, I had spoken to you about the railways in India. The coming of the railway, the first railway lines late in the early 1850s. I pointed out to you that the railways would in time become the largest employer, is still the largest employer, and that the British actually, the way that they funded it, very simply, I mean, there are whole books written just on the funding of the railways, so I'm giving it to you in basically a sentence that, you know, they got British capital, they got British investors who were guaranteed a return of 5%. In some cases 4.5%, but essentially they were guaranteed a return. And this is really the first time that British capital is coming into India. All right. So the railways is obviously one of many things that one could speak about when one is speaking about the political economy. But what we're going to do today is essentially three things. I want to give you the general picture. I want to talk about where India stood within the world economy, what was the manufacturing output, what were some of the significant changes that came about as a consequence of British rule in the domain of economic activity, what happened to Indian handicrafts and textiles, what is the drain theory, as it's called, the drain theory, right? There's a drain theory. So those are the kinds of things that fall under the general purview, including a discussion of famines in India, all right? So that's one thing. The second thing I want to do is I want to look in a little bit more detail at the role of opium in the economy and what are going to be known as the Opium Wars, in particular the first Opium War. That's the one that we're going to look at in somewhat greater detail. And thirdly, I want to look at two essays. Most likely we won't be able to get to the second one, but two essays by Marx. And I'm actually going to begin with that rather than with the general a survey. I'm going to begin with the essay by Marx, two essays that he wrote called British Rule in India and the future results of British rule in India. Both of them written in 1853, both of them written for an American newspaper for which he used to write quite frequently. Right, so there are extraordinarily interesting histories there. How did Marx end up writing for the New York Daily Tribune? And this is a piece that was published on June 25th, 1853, and it's part of a collection of essays called Karl Marx on India. So Marx, as you know, even if you haven't read a word that he's written, as you know, wrote voluminously. The collected works run into dozens of volumes, some pieces co-authored with Engels, of course, but these are pieces that he wrote on India, so they're single authored pieces by him. And he also wrote quite a few pieces on the rebellion of 1857, 58. If we were doing a more advanced seminar, we would have spent time on looking at some of his pieces on 1857, 58, and some of them have very detailed military history. So Marx was a man of many talents and many interests, as I'm sure you know. Anyhow, the main thing is this. Let me give you the argument, and then we look at some of the passages, because it's important to see how he constructs some of the arguments. That notwithstanding the fact that Marx was ferociously anti-colonial in many ways, a critic, obviously, of British imperialism, imperialism in general, nonetheless, he supported British rule in India. All right? He did. And the reason he did so is because of the particular theory of history that he subscribed to. Right? So if you look at his whole account of dialectical materialism or historical materialism, so you know his whole argument in brief is that you have to go through the various stages of history before you can achieve a classless society. Right? You have to have had obviously reached the stage of capitalism before you can in fact actually then aspire to a classless society. So this is the key. this is giving it to you in a nutshell, and there's obviously some simplification involved in putting it in that fashion, but I think that's essential in order for you to be able to understand why he adopts the positions that he does. That given that he views India as still stuck in something that he is going to call the Asiatic mode of production. It's called AMP in the Marxist literature. There's a massive literature on AMP, the Asiatic mode of production. And the Asiatic mode of production, his argument is that India is stuck in it, and in the Asiatic mode of production, for example, there's no conception of private property. Now we know that the picture in India, as I've already discussed before, was actually quite complicated with respect to what were property rights and what was the nature of land revenue, and we know that there were differences in different parts of the country. But nonetheless, he took that view. He relied upon many European authorities or sources, including European travelers, such as, for example, a man called François Bernier, who had traveled in India during the Mughal period and had written extensively on what he thought were questions of property. All right? So he essentially takes the view that India has to actually go through the stages. Britain is going to help India go through these stages. And then, of course, as elsewhere in the world, eventually, you might have a revolution, a real revolution, leading to a classless society. All right. So this is the first article, the British rule in India. Paragraph 3. Note where he's going to fall on the Orientalist-Anglicist divide with the first sentence. Because remember what the Orientalist-Anglicist divide was? The Orientalists took the view that that instruction should be in Sanskrit and Arabic, but this view itself was in fact contingent upon another view, namely that there had been in fact a glorious period of history in India. Then India had fallen into decay, and now it was the destiny of Britain to, as it were, energize India. So what does he say? Quote, "I share not the opinion of those who believe in a golden age of Hindustan." Right? He's very clear. I don't believe that there was anything like a golden age in India. It's not as though India has really fallen into decline. It's really been in decline. I mean, at the same time, if you look at Capital, Volume 1, and a number of other writings, he's very clear that Indian handicrafts industries had declined. He understood, of course, that even as late as 1800, that is almost 4 decades after the conquest, India was still the largest producer of cotton and cotton textiles in the world, and that India's position in this trade was going to diminish rapidly, right? So even though he understood that, but he didn't believe that India was a beacon of what you might call, intellectual achievements and thought, so forth and so on. So he didn't really share the view that many of the intellectuals of Europe did, the ones whom I had described briefly to you when I had spoken about the kind of the Renaissance that took place in European thinking with respect to India in the late 18th century. So he says, there cannot, however, remain any doubt but that the misery inflicted by the British on Hindustan, is of an essentially different and infinitely more intensive kind than all Hindustan had to suffer before. So there's even the admission that the suffering imposed upon the Indians by the British is in fact more intensive, right? Infinitely more intensive, those are his words, than what Hindustan had to suffer before. I do not allude to European despotism. See, he's very candid about that. Now, he doesn't have any illusions about England either, right? Remember, by the way, where he's writing all of this. He's sitting in the British Library. He's sitting in the British Library, and this is where he is accessing all the material, right? I do not allude to European despotism planted upon Asiatic despotism. So he's very clear in his mind that yes, the political system you had in India was despotism, and what have the British done? They have actually imposed their version of despotism, right? Which of course they thought of as being benevolent. They thought of as being benevolent, and Marx is not really going to take that view, because this is, in a sense, it's almost a mechanistic reading where he's saying that Britain, despite everything it wants to do, despite its evil outlook and this and that, it is actually inadvertently, willy-nilly going to usher in a reform. The mere presence of Britain actually is going to usher in a reform in some ways. So I do not allude to European despotism planted upon Asiatic despotism by the British East India Company, forming a more monstrous combination than any of the divine monsters startling us in the temple of Salsette. Extraordinary writing here. Right? Then he goes further down, and now you begin to see the first glimmer of why he thinks that, look, despite all the problems with the British in India, I think that, in fact, the outlook is for the better as a consequence of the British being in India. England has broken down the entire framework of Indian society without any symptoms of reconstitution yet appearing. This loss of his old world with a gain of a new one imparts a particular kind of melancholy to the present misery of the Hindu and separates Hindustan, ruled by Britain, from all its ancient traditions and from the whole of its past history. Right? So the Indian loses his old world. It's not clear what is the new world that he's really going to gain. And the melancholy that has now been visited upon Indians is of a different order. There have been in Asia, generally from immemorial times, but three departments of government. That the government, the state in India only had three functions from the times of remote antiquity. Right? What are these three departments? Finance, or the plunder of the interior. Look at his definition of finance, plunder of the interior. That of war, or the plunder of the exterior. And finally, the Department of Public Works. And public works means things like irrigation, for example, canals, right? There's a very interesting theory. I think in some ways it's absurd, but there's a very interesting theory which comes out of this by a person called Wittfogel. And Wittfogel, Karl Wittfogel, you can read his book, and the book is, I forget the exact title, it's Despotism something, but basically he talks about what he calls hydro-agricultural managerial despotism, by which he means simply that, countries such as Russia, which are extremely large and where there are tracts which are either permanently frozen, or you get these vast areas which are semi-arid, that in these countries and in places such as India as well, the only agency that can actually implement change is the state, because of the enormity of the enterprise that is really involved there. All right. Climate and territorial conditions, especially the vast tracts of desert, right, extending from the Sahara through Arabia, Persia, Indian Tartary to the most elevated Asiatic highlands, constituted artificial irrigation by canals and waterworks the basis of Oriental agriculture. Right. Now again I skip a few passages. Now the British in East India accepted from their predecessors the Department of Finance and of War. So he says the British are doing exactly what the Oriental despots did with respect to finance and war. That is, there is a plunder of the interior, there's a plunder of the exterior, right? But they have entirely neglected that of public works. And that's an extraordinary indictment. And at least as of the time that he was writing in 1853, this was entirely true. Now, we're going to see that after the rebellion of 1857-58 and moving into the 1870s, 1880s, we're going to see that the British are going to start to initiate large-scale irrigation works, systems of canal. One of the persons who is going to initiate that is a man called Arthur Cotton. And if you go to modern-day Andhra, in South India, there are a number of places where you see statues of him. He's still a celebrated figure. And there's quite a lot of folklore about Arthur Cotton as well, because he initiated a number of major irrigation systems in South India. All right? So he's saying that the British actually have neglected the country. And you remember the whole paramountcy doctrine, that one of the grounds on which the British annexed states native states was they said, well, these rulers have been neglectful of their subjects. So Marx is saying exactly the same charge can be laid against the British. They have actually completely neglected public works. All right. However changing, the political aspect of India's past must appear. Its social condition has remained unaltered since its remotest antiquity, until the first decennium of the 19th century. So until the early part of the 19th century, the social condition of India remained unaltered since its remotest antiquity. Right? There you see those two Orientalist tropes. Let's supposing I gave you this sentence in an exam question and said, unpack the whole, I give you a passage, unpack this. So what are the two Orientalist tropes there?
Unchanging India.
Yeah. And the corollary, everything that we have talked about before. Despotism. Despotism. Because what happens in a despotism, right? What is the nature of Indian society? It's a pyramid, you could say. It's a pyramid. Who sits on the top? The Oriental despot. Oriental despot. This is the base. These are the peasants over here toiling away or being lazy, right? Right? And for thousands of years, this remains unchanged. All that happens in Indian history is the guy at the head, at the top, his head gets chopped off. You know, a new despot comes. There's a coup, there's a new empire, a new despot. The heads get chopped off at the top, right? And a new person comes and assumes power. That's the nature of Indian society. There is no, and what's the third related, if you had to put in a different language? There is no history. We don't have to bother with the history of India. India doesn't have a history, essentially, because all you have is this unaltered social condition. That's what you have, right? Until, of course, now he says the first decennium of the 19th century. Now then in the next page he talks about the textile trade, all right, and how India in fact actually lost its supremacy in the textile trade after the establishment of British rule, some decades after the establishment of British rule, right? And he'll give you, of course, you know, figures. He'll give you figures there. And then he moves on. This is part of the reading you had to do, by the way, so you have the whole text in front with you. Then he talks about the village community. That is another trope, right? Because even though, of course, India is unchanging, there is some kind of structure at the bottom there. What is that structure? India is a collection of these village communities. There are thousands, tens of thousands of village communities, largely autarkic meaning independent, self-reliant in some fashion. They may have some trade with each other, because some village communities may specialize in certain things, for example, in the production of copper tools or pots. Another village may have a specialist in weaving, right? Another village may have specialists who are blacksmiths, so forth and so on, potters, right? So essentially what he's saying is what you have is a cluster of these village communities. Now I want to read out to you nearly the end of this last paragraph and a half, and you begin to see the full force of what Marx is really arguing for. Now, sickening as it must be to human feeling to witness these myriads of industrious patriarchal, he's referring to these village communities, these patriarchal and inoffensive social organization disorganized and dissolved into their units, thrown into a sea of woes, and their industrial members losing at the same time their ancient form of civilization. So these people now at the bottom, as a consequence of the British coming to India, they've been thrown into this sea of woes. Things have started to change dramatically, you know, that kind of social anomie that I talked about. And they have lost their ancient, they are slowly losing their ancient civilization and their hereditary means of subsistence. So sickening as all of this is, he says, we must not forget that these idyllic village communities, inoffensive though they may appear, had always been the solid foundation of Oriental despotism. that they restrained the human mind within the smallest possible compass. Right? That these places are also places where the human imagination is crushed completely. They restrain the human mind within the smallest possible compass, making it the unresisting tool of superstition, enslaving it beneath traditional rules, depriving it of all grandeur and historical energies. Right? So this is where these village communities, let's not have romantic ideas about them, he's saying. They are dens of superstition that crush the human spirit. We must not forget the barbarian egotism which, concentrating on some miserable patch of land, has quietly witnessed the ruins of empires, the perpetration of unspeakable cruelties, the massacre of the population of large towns, with no other consideration bestowed upon them than on natural events, itself the helpless prey of any aggressor who deigned to notice it at all. We must not forget that this undignified, stagnatory and vegetative life, these are communities that are vegetating in the teeth of time, right? That this passive sort of existence evoked on the other part in contradistinction wild, aimless, unbounded force of destruction, and rendered murder itself a religious rite in Hindustan. I mean, this is more Orientalist than the Orientalists. That if you just the flowery language, right? Because he's saying, well, and these people here at the bottom, these masses in these village communities, they were the prey, right, for people who were untutored, wild gangs of robbers, and of course those who had rendered murder itself a religious rite. He's talking about the thugs. Remember the whole phenomenon of thuggy that I talked to you about. We must not forget that these little communities were contaminated by distinctions of caste and by slavery, that they subjugated man to external circumstances instead of elevating man to be sovereign of circumstances. That's the Marxist problem, of course. You can see that, right? That that these people became subject to circumstances. But what is it that they should have, that the choice is of elevating man to be sovereign of circumstances. And for circumstances you can substitute nature, right? Because this is one fundamental critique. If I gave you this and I said also give a critique which would be beyond a critique of Marx as an Orientalist, what would it be? It's this whole Marxist idea that man exercises dominion over nature, All right? we'd have to look at Marxism's commitment to a certain kind of technological civilization, whatever the other ambitions it may have about creating socialism and classless society and so forth and so on. But the whole idea of industrial development and the role of technology in it, this has very much been a part of Marxism too, right? So we must not forget that these little communities were contaminated by distinctions of caste and by slavery, that they transformed a self-developing social state into a never-changing natural destiny, and thus brought about a brutalizing worship of nature, exhibiting its degradation in the fact that man, the sovereign of nature, that makes it very clear, man, the sovereign of nature, fell down on his knees in adoration of Hanuman, the monkey, and Sabala, the cow. So he's referring to the fact that in popular forms of Hinduism, one of the major figures who's worshipped is Hanuman, who appears in the form of a monkey. And Marx is saying this is degrading. Of course, what's interesting is Marx's pathetically poor understanding of the whole question of a religion such as Hinduism, right? And we have to be very clear about it, what is really going on here. England, it is true, in causing a social revolution in Hindustan, right? So England is causing a social revolution. It's transforming the country willy-nilly almost, as I said, was actuated only by the vilest interests. So he's very clear. Yeah, look, I don't have any brief on behalf of England. I know what England is up to. England is interested in India not out of some charitable mission of Christian mercy or something like that. It's actuated only by the vilest interests, and was stupid, this is his word, and was stupid in her manner of enforcing them. Right? But that is not the question. The question is, can mankind fulfill its destiny without a fundamental revolution in the social state of Asia? All right? If not, whatever may have been the crimes of England, she was the unconscious tool of history in bringing about the revolution. Okay? So I think that the nature of the argument should here be very clear to you. There is a further piece which I had assigned to you, and we don't really have time to look at that. It's called The Future Results of British Rule in India, written just 2 months after the first piece that I've already cited to you. All right? Now, general questions of political economy. So recall once again that the company had ceased to have a monopoly on the trade in India in 1813. It still retained a monopoly on the trade with China. And this was going to end in 1833. And what this meant was in 1833, the East India Company was no longer a trading concern, actually. It wasn't doing what it was set up to do. 1833, 1834, it was no longer a trading company. It was actually now in the business of governing India, right? And what's happened, of course, something that I've spoken to you about quite a bit, what's happened in the meantime here is, and this, of course, is related to the loss of its monopoly, is the ascendancy of the free traders. Right? Those in Britain in the first, second decades and moving on into the 1830s, 1840s, and that's what's eventually going to lead to the Opium War, the first Opium War with China, that the free traders had started to become extremely prominent, and British goods are going to start to enter the market freely, especially cotton textiles. We're going to find that Indian handicrafts are going to be edged out of the market. So basically, if you had to take a simplistic view of it, raw cotton is going to be shipped, and then it's going to come back in the form of manufactured clothes. All right, and as I've said to you before, India was, at least until around 1800, both the largest grower of cotton and the largest producer of cotton goods in the world. What was India's share of manufacturing, and how did that fall? So let me give you 4 or 5 different discrete things here, just so you get the picture of what's happening. In 1750, India's share of the world manufacturing output was about 22%, 23%. In 1800, it was 19.7%. In 1860, it was 8.6%. And in 1913, it was 1.4%. 1.4%. Okay, that's India's share of the world manufacturing output. So a fall from 22% to 1.4% from 1750 to 1913. Number 2, if we're looking at data, literacy rates in India remained very low throughout British rule. And there are various, we can introduce various kinds of subtleties if we want to do comparisons, but, and of course, comparing what's happening in the late 1700s or 1800s with what happens in, let's say, Cuba after the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution is very often mentioned because within 5 years of Castro's ascendancy in Cuba, literacy rates in Cuba just shot up, and essentially you had full literacy almost within 8-10 years of the revolution. Okay, and yes, of course, there was a different kind of state engineering involved there, but it's a certain commitment by the state. In India, taking figures from the early 20th century, not from the late 1700s or the 1800s, but we're taking figures now from 150 years, at least, after the British established their hegemony in eastern India and then gradually spreading further down south and west. In India, in 1911, the literacy rate was 7%. Yes?
What would it be in Britain?
Substantially higher by this time. Your literacy rate by this point in Britain would certainly be I mean, I haven't checked the figures, but not less than 45%, not less than that, and probably higher, because by then schooling had long been mandatory. Now, there were, of course, pockets of people who didn't. You know, if you came from working class families and you were working in the coal mines, you know, places like that, but it would have been substantially higher, you know. In 1921, so 1911, 7%, 1921, why do I give you figures from 1911, 1921? Census. Because remember, the first census, the first big census was 1871, and then every 10 years, 1881, 1891, 1901, 1911, 1921. 1921, the literacy rate in 10 years had gone up to 8.3%. We're not differentiating here, by the way, between male and female rates, because female literacy was less than 5%. And in rural India, female literacy would have been less than 1%. Less than 1%. So you'd have to distinguish between male and female, and male, not just male and female, but urban and rural India. So you could say male urban rates of literacy would be the highest. And this is just the average here that we're talking about, okay? Number 3, a decline in real wages from 1861 to 1920. There are many sources, but one of the ones which, and I think you do have some pages from this if I'm not mistaken, this is an enterprise that started about 15 years ago called A People's History of India. And it was kind of a rejoinder to these things like the Cambridge history of India, the Oxford history of India. You know, Cambridge and Oxford produced a history of everything, because the idea was when you've got these two major British universities, so they're going to produce the authoritative, you know, history. Well, it wasn't authoritative. What it simply was, it reflected a certain kind of standpoint, of course. And so this is a project called A People's History of India. This is volume 28. The whole thing has not yet been published. It's in 50, 60 volumes. And this is a volume on the Indian economy, 1858 to 1914. So 1858, when, of course, India becomes a crown colony, right? When it's no longer under the jurisdiction of the company in any sense of the term. But there are other sources as well. I'm mentioning them to you if you want to look them up. So apart from this book by Habib, there's an older work by A.R. Desai, well worth looking at, because he also looks at such things as a drain theory, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. Desai, A.R. Desai, the social background of Indian nationalism. All right. Now, one of the things that's been argued is that India experienced enormous loss under the British. This is encompassed, among other things, in what is called the drain theory. Now, the phrase should indicate to you the nature of the theory, that India was, quote, drained of its wealth. All right. What was that phrase that Donald Trump has been using? Draining the swamp or something like that, right? So drain, same word, all right? Here it's not draining the swamp, it's draining the country, you know, all right? And what was a drain theory? Essentially, the drain theory, in order to understand that, we have to look at a number of different things. The major, you can just look at it as a blanket term, that India, in fact, actually is drained of its wealth and is actually going to become impoverished under the British. Particularly if you look at this period, 1858 to 1914. Now, before I get into an elaboration of that, let me show you a slide from Wikipedia. So all you have to do is go to Wikipedia. Okay, this is just a portion of the page. This is, the page is called Timeline of Major Famines in India. So I picked this rather than a nationalist Indian source, on the assumption that, of course, I know that Wikipedia, you know, how it itself gets put together is interesting, because any number of millions of people have contributed and they can edit. But it's called Timeline of Major Famines in India during British rule. We're only seeing a segment of it here. And this table that is given in Wikipedia is by no means complete, not even remotely, I can tell you. Habib has a much more elaborate table of the famines. But just look at this. 1865, Orissa famine of 1866. Okay, so that's the date, and then what is a famine? And Orissa is eastern India. And this table here, you don't see the heading of it. This is a number of casualties. Basically, figures are all given in round numbers, usually. Like, for example, 1.5 million, 5.5 million. These are number of fatalities, number of people who died. I'm not talking about number of people who survived the famine, but might have suffered permanent effects of malnutrition later on. Okay, I'm not speaking about. I'm talking about number of people who died. Down to the present day, by the way, when one speaks of the third world, figures are always 100,000, 200,000, 500,000. One American soldier dies in the New York Times. Every soldier who dies in Iraq, you get the name, and 4,252 have died. And then 3 days later, 4,253. Why? Because every life means something. But when you get to this part of the world, it's all numbers. No names, nothing. It's like Vietnam War memorials. All right? If you go to the Vietnam War memorial in the most well-known one in Washington, D.C., okay, every American soldier who died, the name is recorded. And how many Vietnamese were killed in the Vietnam War? And many by bombing, many by Agent Orange, which was dropped by the Americans. 3 million at a minimum. Now, do you know of any monument that is going to record 3 million names? In fact, is there a single Vietnam War memorial in the United States that records a single Vietnamese name? I'd like to know that. So, there are lots of things you can do when you start interpreting this. It's not only a question of what happened, what does this tell us about what the British were doing, okay? And why am I showing you this particular segment? The reason for that, we're going to go down a little bit. 1865, 1867, Eastern India, the railways had not come in yet. They had come into India already, but not there, not in Orissa. In fact, Orissa was extremely poorly connected. Much of it is still, relative to the rest of India, still comparatively not that well connected. But of course, back then, there were no roads in Orissa. No ports had been developed over there at all right? But it had been under British rule now for a substantial period of time, because Orissa was part of the Bengal presidency, So it had been under British rule for decades at this point in time. Now notice, 1 million, they give a figure there. They are more precise figures they're given, although that where they get those figures from, they don't have them, you can see for others, is actually a matter that I can't get into right now, because we'd have to see how exactly they computed these figures. But 1 million is a general figure given, and then you can see in Rajputana. Now Rajputana is Western India, the extreme opposite, 1.5 million. And 1873, Bihar famine, right? It says there were little to none significant mortalities during the famine over here in 1873. And then if you go to 1876, the Great Famine of 1876, southern India, 5.5 million in British territory. This is British India, not the native states. Mortality unknown for princely states, which means that total mortality may have been 6.1 to 10.3 million. I mean, were you talking 1876? 1876. Okay? By now, the railway network is quite extensive, and you just continue down over here. So another famine in Orissa, 1888. Because, of course, you also have to ask, why, if a famine had taken place in Orissa back then 20 years later, well, you could say, well, had to do with the failure of crops. But then of course, we'd have to ask all kinds of difficult questions. Well, did the British learn to take preventive measures, for example? Did they stockpile grain? What were the railways doing? So a common argument made on behalf of the railways, and if I can remember next time, I'll bring this slide for you. I have a book in my collection called India, the Land of the Black Pagoda. I have no idea what the Black Pagoda is. India is not a land of Black Pagodas. It's called India, Land of the Black Pagoda. It's written by an American by the name of Thomas, published about 1910. And he has a plate there. One of the black and white plates that he has is he shows two boys, and one of them is a boy, and you can see he's completely emaciated. He's a victim of a famine. And it says, the caption says, this boy is a victim of one of the famines that periodically strikes India. Then you see next to him another boy, and he's pot-bellied, which, by the way, is another sign of a victim of a famine. But this person didn't understand that. And the caption there says, this is a photograph of a healthy little boy who is an illustration of the ways in which the railways were able to bring food to famine-stricken areas in India. Okay? Now, in fact, there is an argument which Habib makes and others have made, that in fact the railways actually aggravated, the coming of the railways aggravated the problem of famine. The British didn't anticipate that perhaps, but it did. Why? Because what happens typically, and you have to understand the theory that I mentioned to you in this very class 3 or 4 weeks ago, when I talked about a man called Amartya Sen, a major Indian economist who's considered the leading authority on famines in the world. And one of the things he had argued was that famines never occur simply because of conditions of drought, in other words, they're not, quote, natural calamities. They're always man-made, in the sense that the real problem in famines is what he calls the lack of entitlements, that people don't actually have the means to pay for food, because what happens when you have a scarcity to some degree, there is some scarcity, it's not the scarcity that would lead to famine, but when you have some scarcity, what typically is going to happen is the prices are going to go up dramatically, because people are going to start hoarding, and of course the people are going to realize that they can make a profit out of it. All right. So what happens what happened, and this is where, if you go to 1896, so the Orissa famine 1865 is a pre-railway era famine, if I may put it this way. All right. 1896-97, the famine, another 5 million deaths. Now notice again, that was 10 million, 5 million. I mean, you're talking about huge numbers here. Okay? Indian famine of 1896-97, Madras, Bombay, Deccan, Bengal, UP, Central Provinces. This is quite widespread. These are all places, by the way, that are well connected now. Well connected by the railways. All right? So yes, you have a scarcity in some areas. The railways are used to ship goods. However, what happens, given how widespread this was already, what happens is that in the place where food grains are being brought over, the prices will go down. So you will temporarily alleviate the problem there. However, the place from where the grain has been shipped will now start experiencing scarcity. Prices will go up there. And so what in fact has been argued by a number of people who have looked at this quite carefully is that the area of famine becomes more extensive. It spreads as a consequence of the railways, at least as it was being deployed back then. Okay? So now, I may not be able to take questions right now, okay? So now, what are we talking about here? What we're talking about, let's go back to, so we're saying, okay, let me finish up with this. So the question, there's a problem of famines. We're saying mortality is very high. If you have to use a cumulative figure, I would say not less than 25 million people that were killed on account of famines from about 1860 until about the end of the 1890s. Okay, not less than 25 million people, possibly many more, right? And then related sets of issues which take us beyond economic history also take us to social history, obviously. Well, what was the nature of public works? Did the British eventually introduce public works? So, for example, in 1896-97, they did introduce public works. And public works means what? Actually means digging canals for irrigation, for example, digging ditches. all right, possibly laying out railway lines, the tracks, right? These would be all instances of public works. However, I don't know if I mentioned this, but even if I did, this would be again the apt time. This is because this is really quite extraordinary, and you have to go to a book by a man called Mike Davis, okay, who wrote a book which is eminently readable. It's persuasive and beautifully written. Mike Davis is the author, professor at UC Irvine, a bit of a American renegade intellectual. So what does he say? The Victorian Holocaust has about 100 pages on famines in India, right? So Victorian Holocaust that took place during the reign of Victoria and around that time. And one of the things he argues, looking at all the famine reports and famine commissions, was and how these public works were working. So when you had these public works, what they did was they basically experimented the British. How much can you pay an Indian peasant or laborer, okay, how to work there for 10 hours? How little do you have to pay? And payment was usually not by cash, it was by kind, meaning that you would give grain. You would give grain, usually uncooked, right, grain, and then, so for 10 hours of labor you get, let's say, a handful of rice, all right, or wheat, or whatever the case may be, all right. So the experiment was, how little can you give them to be able to sustain them and make sure that they're fit enough to come and work the next day for 10, 12 hours. Because if you give too much, you're basically wasting it. If, in other words, you're giving 100 grams, the equivalent of, let's say, 100 grams of uncooked rice, but the person can actually do with 80 grams because you keep on experimenting. You lower the 100 to 99.5, then to 99, then to 98.5. And say the person is coming back. It keeps on coming back. Well, then why give the higher figure? Give the lower figure, right? Give the lower figure. Now, what is the relationship between this? Because one of the things that Mike Davis argues is that in the concentration camps in Germany, the Nazis read all of these famine reports. Why? Because, as you know, many of the concentration camps were, in fact, also labor camps, right? They were, some of them were just purely extermination camps, and Auschwitz, the most famous or infamous, was both a labor camp and an extermination camp, right? It's a massive complex. And so what they're trying to do there is exactly the same thing. They're trying to understand, how little can you give this guy? It has to be enough that the person is able to come back, because if it's too little, the person collapses, then you've got a dead body on your hands. All right? So can you, for example, give 500 calories a day and hope that this person is going to be able to come back the next day and the day after and the day after? And they read these reports. Right? Extraordinary connections over here that we have to think about. All right. So now, let me be very clear. I'm not saying that the British were Nazis, because this is how I know. If I said this on Fox, they'd say, you're saying the British are Nazis. No, I'm not saying the British are Nazis. but what I'm saying is that there are forms of oppression that are cognate in many ways. All right, similar in some ways. Number two, that oppressors learn from other oppressors too. All right, and that this is not simply a matter of a numbers game here that we have to think about. We have to think about, well, what was the responsibility of the British? Did they abdicate their responsibility or not? And if we're looking at these tall claims that are sometimes made about all the good things that the British brought to India, including the English language apparently, and parliamentary institutions and so forth and so on, well, I think we would have to start looking at what was the real nature of British rule in India. All right. Now, if you look at the drain theory, so the drain theory as I said, the general formulation is clear enough that India actually became impoverished under British rule. There's other ways to describe it. If you're looking at manufacturing output, I've already given you the figures. The manufacturing output of India is considerably diminished. Yet another language, India was de-industrialized. De-industrialized. All right. There's a big debate on that, because some people argue that, well, there really wasn't much, quote, industry, in India, or that the industry that existed was in areas, or manufacturing that existed was in areas such as, for example, textiles, and that there were some changes that were taking place in the global economy, and that India simply wouldn't have been able to keep up with them anyhow. Right? And I'm not going to get into such questions as, well, would India have had an industrial revolution, for example, of its own accord or not, so forth and so on. That's a direction in which many people may want to go. But deindustrialization there simply also has to do with the fact that the capacity of Indian industry, the capacity of manufacturing units was considerably diminished, and there were very few things that were actually being made in India. One of the two major industries that really did develop under the British were those which didn't require the kind of industrial innovation that would have been needed else for other kinds of inventions. And what were those two? Cotton and jute. Jute. Okay, so jute products. All right, these are going to be quite important. However, what is the specific form of the drain theory? The specific form of it has to do with what is called home charges. Home charges. Let me explain what I mean by home charges. After 1858, as you know, we're looking at this period here now. There is going to be an establishment. There was always an establishment before. That was the East India Company and the employees who were working for the company back in England, right? But that was compared to what is going to happen post 1858. It's very small. And as you move into the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and that was the case with administrative establishments all over the world. You know, they've just become much larger. I mean, look at what the size of the federal government was in the U.S. Let's say, for example, 1900, and what it was 1950. Okay, a massive increase, far outstripping, for example, the increase proportionately in population. All right. So the establishment in England is the establishment that is associated with the Secretary of State for India, because this is now a cabinet position. This is a cabinet position. And so there's going to be a whole staff that's going to develop around him, and eventually around the whole office, the India office as it was called, the India office, is going to become a massive establishment. Now, where are the salaries of these people coming from? They're not coming from Britain. They're coming from India. Okay? They're coming from India. So now the revenues being generated in India are being used not just to pay for the whole establishment in India itself, which of course you could say, well, that's the British have set this up, maybe they should be paying from their revenues back in England. No, it's all being paid for by Indian revenues. But it's not only the Governor General or the Viceroy and his establishment whose salaries are being paid, and the salaries of all the people employed in the Indian civil service. Okay? It is all those who were in England itself. Their salaries are being paid as well. So these are what are called the home charges. If Indian soldiers are being used to fight Britain's war, I think you'd have to agree that 1914, World War I don't think you can call it India's war, right? But if they're Indian soldiers who are being used there, why should those salaries come out of Indian revenues if they're fighting Britain's wars? Now, if you were saying that they were fighting a war to contain dissent in India, possibly, you'd say, yeah. But no, they're actually fighting in Australia, or they're fighting in Gallipoli, right? All of these charges are being reverted back to India. And all the civil servants who retired and went back to England, their salaries are all being paid out of Indian revenues. Okay? These are what are called home charges. There were many different categories of home charges, and one of the things that John F. Richards argues in his article on opium, which was assigned to you, okay, a lot of it is a lot of data, but there are interesting arguments there. You know, one of the things that he argues is that one reason why the British persisted all the way, even long after the two opium wars and the opium trade. In fact, the height of opium exports was in fact 1890s. That was the height of it. Okay, then slowly after that, for a number of reasons, it's going to start to decline, and then by the 1930s, the opium trade is pretty much dwindled. But one of the reasons he argues that they persisted with, in fact, this opium trade was because the revenues from that were also used to pay for these home charges. All right? So this is one concrete manifestation of what is called, okay, the drain theory. The general form, as I said, simply is that India was drained of its wealth. Now, of course, things change over a period of time in some respects because, for example, the late 19th century, even though India's share of the world manufacturing output certainly had fallen down to 1.4% by 1913, the late 19th century did see a slight increase in India's overseas trade. One of the reasons it saw that was because of the growth through the railway system. So when you have a very extensive railway system, it obviously makes it easier to centralize the dispatch of goods, particularly from the interior, okay, to the ports and to various kinds of warehouses and so forth on. And there's obviously modern administrative systems, a kind of a streamlining that is really going to, take place, right? But one way to look at all of this is to ask, for example, and one has to be careful how one uses it, this concept, but I'm able to use it, the concept being namely the concept of the middle class, that I'm able to use this concept because certainly both in Britain and in the United States by the mid-19th century, you had what you might call a middle class. Okay? India did not have a middle class. There was no middle class in India. In fact, I would go so far as to argue there was no middle class in India until shortly after independence. The real middle class only began to emerge in much larger numbers with the neoliberalization policies pursued by India in the beginning in the late 1980s, moving into the 1990s. That's much later. But we're saying that all the way until the end of British rule, there was no middle class. So you had a kind of an elite, aristocratic, native elite, and you had a top layer of the elite that was well educated, professionals, relatively small numbers, people who were trained as lawyers, for example. That was one of the big professions that Indians went into, and many of the Indian nationalists, in fact, were trained as lawyers. But then you had people at the bottom, and that would have been the vast majority of Indians, who were basically struggling to make an existence to varying degrees. There, including those who were struck down by famine, suffered from malnutrition, and then others who made ends meet, but there was no middle class. And by that, these are very important things, because what is a middle class? A middle class is a notoriously elastic concept even today. If you ask a sociologist how many people are part of the Indian middle class today, you'll get a number anywhere from 125 to 350 million. Well, that's a huge. If it were let's say 125 to 135, you'd say, well, that's within the margin of error, right? But 125 to 350 million. That's because it's very difficult. What is a middle class? If it's a consuming class, for example, right? Well, then the figure is more likely 350. But then we have to say consuming at what level? Because many people in India who are middle class, they would be considered lower class in the United States if you go by levels of consumption. Of course, by levels of consumption, most people in the world would be considered lower class because Americans consume at an extraordinary rate, right? So, but I'm saying even relatively, if you look at it that way, that's a problem. The other way to look at the middle class, and this is where you see the failure of British rule in many ways, in the United States and Germany, okay, and Britain. I'm taking 3 examples. You could add France to that, certainly. In these countries, a middle class meant the emergence of the idea of common social goods. Common social goods. What would common social goods be? Such things as a public library system. A public library system. Street lighting. Street lighting is a fascinating subject. There's a fantastic book written by Shivelbush, a historian called Shivelbush, which is on lighting and street lighting and how did that change the whole city, you know, okay? But it's a common social good because you're walking down the street, it's completely dark, right? Well, there are hazards. You could fall into a ditch, a road that's not been properly dug, you could be subject to attack more easily, so forth and so on. Right? These are common social goods. That is, they're understood that they're not just for a certain class of people, they're for everyone. That's what I mean by common social goods. Right? Now, in India, you had, under the British, this never developed. No conception of these common social goods ever developed. There was no public library system that ever developed, for example, you know. And I think you have to evaluate a country that's ruling another country for 200 years by some of these yardsticks, all right? So when I talk about a middle class, so now we're just arguing from retrospectively going back, we're saying, all right, so if we look at the drain theory, if we look at what the nature of the British economy was in India, nature of the economy in India under British rule, we're saying that, well, there was really no development of the middle class at all. India did not develop self-sufficiency in food grains. That's the famines shows that. So I've mentioned 2 things here. And thirdly, it did not develop a modern industrialist class. Right? You begin to see a little bit of that towards the end, where you've got a number of Indian entrepreneurs, including the Tatas, still a major worldwide company now. The beginnings go back to that period, the Bajaj Group, people like that. Right? But on the whole, you do not see that throughout the 19th century moving into, in fact, the 20th century. All right? And finally, I want to spend a few minutes on that. I will talk a little bit in my next lecture when I look at social reform movements very briefly. I will also talk about such things as canal irrigation very briefly over there. But when I speak about the political economy, I want to spend about 5 minutes on the opium question of the Opium Wars. But when I speak about political economy in India, in colonial India, it intersects with certain elements of social history. One of the things that changed, just as an illustration, but this is going to happen in the late 19th century. That's when it really begins to happen. When the government establishment begins to grow. When the size of the government begins to grow, different departments are going to be created. And what is going to emerge from there? The salaried job. The idea of a salaried job, by the way, is a relatively new thing in history. Relatively new thing in history. The idea that you go, you know, and you get a salary. You go from 9 to 5. And of course, for working class families and lower class families, even down to the present day to some degree, this was all regimented. So you had to, when you went to work, you had to put on a card into a time machine, a slot, and it would stamp the time. So what happens now? Indians are going to begin to learn to live by clock time. This is where you move into social history now. Clock time, the tyranny of the clock, right, which I can see right there. The tyranny of the clock. People never lived by the tyranny of the clock. And again, something you could say happens at different times in different societies. In India, it happened very late. And I think that's one reason why I think Indians still resist it. So that's why, Indian Standard Time, as it's called, is Indian stretchable time. So, when you invite somebody at 7, well, it could mean anywhere between 7 and 11. It's stretchable. People don't live by the tyranny of the clock in the same way. What this new emerging social formation did was to introduce clock time. And then people who started to live by the clock time and who had salaried jobs as well, and whose salary was then tied to their performance as measured by the clock. And this performance is measured by the clock, not just whether you're arriving on time or not. It's Taylorite. So there's this guy called Frederick Taylor. This is one of the great tyrants of history, if you ask me, although he's celebrated as a great hero. Taylor, okay, Taylorite. What is this guy? He's an American social scientist. He writes this manual, which becomes used. Every corporation in America is going to use it. Every corporation. So he gives you a measurement of how much time should be taken for a certain task, because he's trying to set standards of efficiency. If you can't meet those standards of efficiency, what do? You fire a person. Okay? So for example, he tells you, how long should it take for a secretary to pull out a file from a file drawer? If it takes more than 12.4 seconds, she's inefficient. He gives you a precise calculation for every job, every task. That's Taylorite. So this oppression of clock time, okay, is not simply arriving on time and not cheating, that you arrive there at 10, right, but you claim that you arrived there at 9. And that's the reason why they had wanted you to punch your card, all right, and that when you left, they made sure that you didn't leave before you were supposed to leave. Right? This is, of course, surveillance, a regime of surveillance. There are so many ways in which you can talk about what is really going on here. I'm saying this is all part of the new social formation that's coming in, all right? And of course, eventually assembly line production, so forth and so on. Okay, finally, very briefly, opium. So I've actually spoken about this. Remember, I've talked about the triangular trade, India, China, Britain. I've talked about it in some detail there, but I want to revisiting this now because of the Opium War. The first Opium War being 1839 to 42, the second one being 1856-60. Okay, so that takes us, transitions us from the company to India being a crown colony. And you remember that this triangular trade was that initially, of course, the British are buying, they get hooked onto tea, they're buying tea from Britain, and what are they, from China, the British, and what are they sending back to China? Same problem they had with India initially. The Chinese didn't want anything either that the British had. Absolutely nothing, the taste for Scotch whiskey hadn't developed at that point in time, all right. So what did they send? They sent bullion. Silver, gold. If you look at the 1880s, you find that 1860s, 70s, it's basically roughly about the same, silver, gold. But we're going back to an early period. We're saying that that's how it starts, and then of course, moving through the 1700s, moving into the 1800s, what we're going to find is that when Britain takes control of India, they're going to start growing opium. This is going to be regulated by the company, by Warren Hastings. So by the 1770s, the company was actually regulating opium production. Only those peasants who were authorized by the company could do so. Okay, and about 2% of the total agricultural land, if I may put it this way, in India was given over to opium production. 2% roughly, all right, involving possibly at its height about 2 million cultivators. Now this opium is then going to be used, is going to be shipped to China, and in part it's going to be used to pay for the tea that Britain is importing from China. But eventually what's going to happen is a reverse flow of the bullion, in fact, actually. So the British are going to insist that they get payments, now we're talking about the early 1800s, that they get payment actually in silver, with lots of consequences for the Chinese economy outside the question of what opium itself did. However, you can read about all of this in the Richards article. So there are 2 articles there that you have, and one of the fundamental frameworks that you have to look at is that the free traders have a certain conception. So of what free trade can do. For them, free trade is actually linked to their conception of the internationalization of commerce and a certain kind of new world order. On the other hand, there's an urge for protectionism in China itself. Okay, this protectionism came about partially as a consequence of a certain kind of Confucian view, which did not view trade as something that was elevating. Yes, one has to engage in it, but as Napoleon had once said of England, England is a nation of shopkeepers. It's a miserly little thing you do, trade and shopkeeping. This is not for people who are elevated, right? There was some kind of conception of that in Confucian China as well. So that's the backdrop. Unfortunately, I can't finish with this today. I will turn to this for several minutes in my following lecture. But we're pretty much on track. So you make sure you get to week 8 readings. And once again, no class on Tuesday, but I will send you an email and we'll try to confirm if I can get a room for Thursday. Okay, for 5 to 6:15.